Julie Ward was a quiet, gentle young woman who had fallen in love with Africa on 2 earlier visits. After months of planning, she left excitedly for an overland trip in the Masai Mara in Kenya. Her family never seen her alive again. Julie Ward had worked for 8 years as a publisher's assistant near her hometown of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, before quitting her job to see the world. By the summer of 1988, she was in Kenya, where for 2 months she enjoyed the vast beauty of its lonely wilderness and its teeming wildlife. It was Julie's 3rd trip to Africa, and she had planned on setting up a business selling tribal jewellery. On September the 2nd, she left Nairobi and drove with a friend, marine biologist Glenn Burns, to stay at the Sand River campsite right in the heart of the world-famous Masai Mara Game Park. A keen amateur photographer, Julie had planned to record the migration of wildebeest. The next day, whilst tracking the huge herds, their Suzuki Jeep broke down near the Mara Serena Lodge. Glenn and Julie spent the night at the lodge before Glenn flew back to Nairobi to get the spare part that was needed for the Jeep. During the next 2 days, however, another camper managed to repair the Jeep for Julie, so she checked out of the Mara Serena Lodge, intending to drive first to the Sand River camp to collect the tents that she and Glenn had left behind, and then on to Nairobi. Against advice, she was planning on travelling alone. The 200-mile drive back to Nairobi was mainly on dirt roads, and should have only taken 6 to 7 hours. The first hint that anything was amiss came when her father, John Ward, a 57-year-old wealthy hotelier, was expecting Julie home. He phoned to check her travel arrangements and found that she had been missing for several days. Telephone calls to friends revealed that she was neither in Nairobi nor at the Mara Serena Lodge. The following day, September 11th, John flew out to organise a search for his daughter. By September the 13th, he had hired a helicopter and 5 planes to scour the game reserve, as police were showing little interest. The searchers divided up a huge parcel of land, some 40,000 square miles, and began searching. For a day, the pilots winged their way up to treetop level, crisscrossing the dusty plains, riverbeds, and watering holes. At around 10 AM the next day, Julie's sandy-coloured Jeep was found abandoned, bogged down in the bed of the creek leading into the Sand River. Mud had been piled on top of the roof to form the letters SOS, but there was no sign of Julie. John knew instinctively that there was something wrong. His daughter had a habit of leaving notes about everything, but there was no note found inside the Jeep. After a detailed search of the area, the party returned to the Kikarok Lodge to discuss how best to continue the hunt. They decided to use 1 helicopter and 1 fixed-wing aeroplane. These took off at around 2 PM, with John in the front seat of the aeroplane. They carried out a general sweep of a 40-mile radius of the Jeep. At around 4 PM, a call came in from a ranger at the Kikarok Lodge to say that a body had been discovered. Numb with shock, John was returned to Kikarok and was driven towards the site in a Land Rover provided by park rangers. 5 minutes later, to John's frustration, the driver got lost. He drove to an outpost where a ramshackle collection of huts was used by park rangers during tours of duty. John used the radio there to request a helicopter to fly him to the scene. Then, whilst waiting, he made a discovery that would later prove a major clue in the story of what had happened to Julie. As he anxiously paced the compound, his eyes were suddenly drawn to something shiny on the ground. It was a Kenyan coin with a tiny silver camera battery positioned carefully on the top. John realised that someone had put it there in the full glare of the sun to recharge, but he paid little attention, his mind only focused on his daughter. Little did he know, the battery had been placed there by Julie. The helicopter soon arrived and flew him to the site of the reported find. There, under the darkening African sky, lay the last remains of Julie Ward. The severed lower half of a leg, a jawbone cleanly sliced in two, and a hank of blonde hair. Nearby was a fire scattered with various personal belongings. Through his tears, John gathered up what was left of his daughter and handed the remains to a police inspector. The obvious theory was that Julie had gotten stuck in the riverbed and, whilst trying to walk for help, had been waylaid and murdered. Her expensive Olympus camera and lens were missing, but there were already baffling inconsistencies. Why had Julie's Jeep turned off the main road after just 3 miles? If she got stuck, why didn't she retrace her steps back to the main road that was always busy with tourists? The pathologist revealed that she had been dead for around 12 hours when her remains had been found. So where had she been for the other 6 days? Julie was found 7 miles from her Jeep, so why had she covered such a small distance in such a large length of time? Why was her map left on the dashboard in her Jeep? And why was her backpack burned in a fire that had been started with petrol? John Ward was already suspicious that nothing about his daughter's death was as it seemed. He quickly formed the view that she had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, then murdered to cover it up. Within a fortnight of her death, John's suspicions grew further when Kenyan authorities officially dismissed the likelihood of Julie having been murdered. John, who had flown back to England, immediately returned to Kenya, determined not to let his daughter's murder be covered up. He told reporters, "Kenya is a country that relies on tourism. In the case of murder, there may be a temptation to look the other way." John was further encouraged when issued by Kenyan police pathologist Dr. Adel Yusuf Shaker that there was clear signs of murder. But later, before her death was presented to an inquest, the words "cleanly cut," referring to the condition of Julie's bones, were found to have been overwritten with the words "torn and cracked" by Dr. Jason Kavita, the chief government pathologist, suggesting that Julie had been killed by wild animals and that the animals had been fighting, and this was how the body had been tossed into the fire. After hearing this, John had his daughter's remains flown home to England to be examined by Austin Gresham, a Home Office pathologist. In his report, he said that Julie's injuries bore no resemblance to those that would have been caused by wild animals. Julie's killers had been human and had used a machete or another long-bladed jungle knife. One blow had cut off her head, another had severed her leg at the knee. The inquest into Julie's death was opened at the Central Criminal Court in Nairobi in August of 1989, almost a year after Julie's death. The inquest quickly took on the air of a murder trial, with Kenyan authorities openly accused of a cover-up, and game park rangers and a park policeman put forward as her likely killers. Dr. Adel Yusuf, the pathologist who originally told John Ward that his daughter had been cut up with a machete, came under fierce cross-examination. After telling the jury on the first day that in his view Julie had been murdered, Shaker then admitted that his boss, Dr. Jason Kavita, chief government pathologist, had deliberately altered his report without actually examining her remains himself. The next day, whilst denying any pressure had been put on him overnight, Shaker suddenly remembered a second examination that had taken place with Dr. Kaviti present, where it certainly did look like her injuries had been caused by animals. The inquest exposed an itinerary of blunders, cover-ups, lies, and lack of professionalism. In the first 8 days after Julie's bones were found, police supposedly investigating the case took only 2 statements from Dr. Shaker and a friend who identified her remains. Superintendent Muchiri Wano, the detective who took over the case, admitted that he had not tried to trace any of the game rangers on duty at the time of Julie's fateful journey. He hadn't searched any of the rangers' homes or taken fingerprints. It was found that Julie had not signed the guest register before leaving Sand River Camp, yet a clerk, David Nchoko, had later forged her signature. This was only found when John Ward actually visited the camp and realised that the signature was not that of his daughters. However, when questioned, Nchoko said that he did this to keep the record straight, but it was put to him that he could have written her name instead of forging her signature. After seeing the post-mortem results, Superintendent Wanao issued his own report claiming that there were no signs of foul play and Julie had committed suicide. A police forensics team had taken 10 days to reach the scene of the murder, but they made a report claiming that Julie had been overcome by toxic flames after her handbag had caught alight, leading her to lose consciousness and fall into the fire. Police and pathologists insisted that Julie had been attacked by wild animals while sitting at her campfire, but anyone with the slightest knowledge of natural history knows that wild animals are frightened by flames and will not approach them. The chief warden of the Masai Mara, Simon Ole Makala, was also given a tough time in the witness box by John's barrister, Byron Georgiadis, who accused him outright of being Julie's murderer. Georgiadis accused him of abducting Julie, murdering her, and driving her jeep to the river, and planting it in the mud to make it appear as though she had gotten stuck. Makala denied the allegation and claimed that he couldn't have done this because he can't drive. He was later exposed as a liar by 3 witnesses who said that Makala had worked as a driver for them in the past. He later tripped himself up again when he told the court that he knew Julie's Jeep did not have a 4-wheel drive, a point that had not been publicly revealed at the time. Georgiadis was not a man to be messed with. He made it very clear that the whole trial was a fiasco and a tissue of lies. He also added that the wild animal theory was nonsense because they don't barbecue their meat over a petrol-fed fire. The inquest lasted more than 2 months. On October the 27th, John won the battle to prove that his daughter had been murdered. However, it was still unknown who had committed Julie's murder. It was also concluded that Julie's Jeep had been deliberately driven into the gully to make it look as though she had gotten lost. John Ward now insisted that Kenyan authorities take up his offer that they had previously refused, to have Scotland Yard send out officers to work on the case. At the end of February, on the personal invitation from Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi, prompted by pressure from Douglas Hurd at the British Foreign Office, 2 officers, Detective Superintendent Graham Searle and Detective Inspector Dave Shipperley, flew out to Kenya to begin their own investigation into Julie's murder. The 2 men immediately got to work. Witnesses who had testified were re-interviewed. In less than 3 weeks, they had a clear picture of what had happened. They visited the cluster of ranger huts at a spot on the reserve known as Makare, where John had stumbled upon the camera battery. The battery was now evidence that Julie had been there. The Masai Rangers knew nothing of solar energy, and tourists did not visit there. Each hut was swept, and several long blonde hairs were found to have matched Julie's. The huts had been used by 2 park rangers, 26-year-old Peter Capine and 28-year-old Jonathan Wa, both married men with families. Both men were taken in for questioning. Their stories were full of lies and contradictions. They were the only rangers who had been in the area when Julie vanished, but both denied having met or harmed her. The detectives were convinced that they had found the killers. To add to the horror, Jonathan Wa had a very important father, the President of Kenya. Their theory was that Julie had taken a wrong turning off of the main trail whilst looking for a shortcut and had blundered into the soft stream bed. There she waited for rescue, lighting fires to attract the attention of passing pilots, writing her SOS message on the roof of her Jeep. The detectives believed that she may have been there for up to 2 days, trying to use logs and a jack to get her vehicle off of the mud. It was then that the 2 park rangers patrolling on foot had stumbled upon her. Instead of radioing immediately for help, they claimed that the radio was dead due to battery problems. The two men invited Julie to accompany them to their camp to wait for help. The detectives believed that Julie would have happily gone with them if she had believed that she was being rescued. They believe that Julie was more than likely raped and then held hostage. 6 days later, her captors saw the signs of the Big Air search trying to locate her, and in a panic, killed her with their pangas, a type of machete issued to park rangers. They then carried her body to a remote point where they hacked her into bits and set her alight using petrol taken from her Jeep. They scattered her possessions, hoping that anyone that found her would think that she died accidentally or had been eaten by predators. The officers seemed to rule out McCalla, who had lied at the inquest, and seemed to exonerate the clerk who forged the signature. This was a decision that was to be controversial in the forthcoming trial. The trial of the two game rangers opened on Monday the 10th of February 1992. Many saw it as not just the trial of the two rangers, but the reputation of Kenya. The case started with the defence challenging Professor Gresham speaking on behalf of the Ward family. Defence barrister James Orengo said that Gresham could not demonstrate that Julie had been murdered at all. He caused further offence by implying that Julie was of loose morals and had brought the disaster on herself. John Ward spent several days in the witness stand, first giving the court the benefit of 3 years of detective work that he had conducted at his own expense, and later attacking the authorities who attempted to whitewash his daughter's case. The case, which was expected to last 4 weeks, dragged on for 4 months. In June, the two rangers were acquitted. The judge, however, criticised police for trying to orchestrate a cover-up. 2 days after the trial ended, John Ward took out an advertisement offering 50,000 Kenyan shillings for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Julie's killers. Although the advert failed to elicit any information of value, John pursued his investigations. McCalla had long since been John's prime suspect, and after another 6 years, he managed to bring him to trial. On the 17th of September 1999, a Kenyan High Court judge acquitted McCalla, citing lack of evidence. Then, at the beginning of 2003, John at last received more promising news. Kenya's new government, keen to disown the corruption of the past, indicated that it would reopen the 14-year-old case in an effort to solve it once and for all. A senior aide to President Kibaki commented, "There was clearly a cover-up, and well-connected officials have been protected. As our new president said, the era of the whitewash is over." One of the suspects, Jonathan Moi, died in April of 2019. But it was only after the death of his father, President Moi, in February, that witnesses finally felt safe enough to come forward with information. Sadly, to this day, Julie's case has still not been resolved. In 2023, John Ward's surviving sons, Bob, now 60, and Tim, 61, announced that their father, who had made over 150 trips to Kenya since his daughter's murder, had passed away. Julie's remaining family members have vowed to never stop, but sadly, to this day, her case remains unsolved.